The skies above the planet Valor 9 were eerily quiet. The calm before the storm, some would say. Valor 9, a remote and strategically crucial planet on the outer fringes of human-controlled space, was about to become the stage for a battle that would go down in history. The planet had long been a buffer between the human colonies and the ever-encroaching territories of the Scyther swarm, a relentless alien species known for their numbers and ferocity. Captain Ethan Cross, a seasoned veteran of the Terran Marines, stood on the observation deck of the command ship, staring out at the barren landscape below. The planet's surface was a mix of rocky plains and jagged mountains, with sparse vegetation and an atmosphere thick with dust. It was not a place anyone would choose to live, but its strategic location made it invaluable. Cross had seen countless battles in his time, but this one felt different. The Scyther swarm had been moving closer and closer to human space, and Valor 9 was the last line of defense. If they broke through here, the core worlds would be at risk. He knew what was at stake, and so did his men. The Marines had been preparing for this battle for weeks, fortifying their positions and running drills day and night. They were ready as they could be, but against the Scyther swarm, nothing was ever certain. "Captain," a voice called out behind him. It was Lieutenant Sarah Cade, his second in command. "The scouts have returned. The swarm is on the move. They'll be here within the hour." Cross nodded, his jaw tightening. "Good. Have the men take their positions. We hold this line, no matter what." Cade saluted and hurried off to relay the orders. Cross took one last look at the planet below, then turned and headed toward the bridge. The time for reflection was over. Now, it was time to fight. The Marines moved with precision, taking up their positions along the ridges and in the trenches they had dug across the plains. Automated turrets and heavy artillery were set up, their targeting systems scanning the horizon for any sign of the enemy. The soldiers checked their weapons, adjusting their armor and steeling themselves for the coming battle. Cross joined Cade on the command bridge, where the tactical display showed the incoming Scyther forces. They were moving fast, a massive horde that stretched as far as the sensors could detect. The swarm was relentless, a tide of bioengineered warriors driven by a single hive mind. They had no fear, no hesitation. They would throw themselves at the enemy until either they were destroyed or their target was overrun. "Here they come," Cade muttered, her eyes fixed on the display. Cross watched as the first wave of Scyther appeared on the horizon, a dark mass that seemed to blot out the sun. They moved with terrifying speed, closing the distance between them and the Marine positions in a matter of minutes. "Hold the line," Cross ordered, his voice calm but commanding. "Wait for my signal." The tension in the air was palpable as the Marines watched the swarm approach. The ground began to shake as the horde drew nearer, the sound of their countless feet a rumbling roar that filled the air. "Now," Cross shouted. The battlefield erupted in a cacophony of gunfire and explosions as the Marines unleashed their full arsenal. Artillery shells rained down on the advancing swarm, tearing through their ranks and sending chunks of alien flesh flying. The automated turrets whirred to life, spitting streams of bullets into the horde, cutting down wave after wave of Scyther warriors. But the swarm was undeterred. For every alien that fell, two more took its place. They surged forward, their numbers seemingly endless, crashing against the Marine defenses like a tidal wave. Cross barked orders over the comms, directing his men to focus their fire on the heaviest concentrations of Scyther. The Marines fought with everything they had, their rifles blazing, their heavy weapons spewing death into the oncoming horde. But the Scyther kept coming, their sheer numbers threatening to overwhelm the human defenders. "Keep firing," Cross roared. "We hold this line." The battle raged on, the Marines holding their ground even as the Scyther swarm pressed ever closer. The air was thick with smoke and the stench of burning flesh, the ground littered with the bodies of both human and alien warriors. It was a fight for survival. desperate struggle against an enemy that knew no fear, no mercy. As the hours dragged on, the Marines began to tire. Ammunition ran low, and the relentless onslaught of the Xyler showed no signs of slowing. But they held on, driven by the knowledge that if they failed here, there would be nothing to stop the swarm from reaching the core worlds. "Captain, we can't hold them much longer," Cade shouted over the din of battle. Cross knew she was right. The line was faltering, the Marines pushed to their limits, but they couldn't give up, not now. "Send in the reserves," Cross ordered. "We'll make our stand here." The reserve units, fresh and eager to join the fight, charged into the fray, reinforcing the beleaguered Marines on the front lines. Their arrival gave the defenders a brief respite, but the Xyler continued to press forward, their numbers overwhelming. It was then that Cross made a decision. A risky, desperate move, but one that might just turn the tide. "Cade, get me the coordinates for a full orbital strike," he ordered. Cade looked at him in shock. "Captain, that could wipe us all out." Cross met her gaze, his expression grim. "It's the only way. We have to break their momentum, or we're finished." Cade hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Coordinates locked in, sir." Cross took a deep breath and keyed in the command. "All units, fall back to the secondary perimeter. We're calling in an orbital strike on our position. Move now." The Marines began a rapid retreat, pulling back to the secondary defensive line as the Xyler swarm surged forward to fill the gap. The alien horde, sensing victory, pressed their advantage, pouring into the now abandoned trenches. As the Marines fell back, the command ship's targeting systems locked onto the coordinates Cross had provided. High above the planet, the ship's main cannons powered up, their massive barrels glowing with energy. "Fire," Cross commanded. The cannons unleashed their fury, beams of energy lancing down from the sky and slamming into the ground with the force of 1,000 bombs. The battlefield was engulfed in a blinding light, the shockwave tearing through the ranks of the Xyler swarm, vaporizing everything in its path. The Marines watched from their new positions as the devastation unfolded. The ground shook violently, and the air was filled with the deafening roar of the orbital strike. When the light finally faded and the dust began to settle, the battlefield was unrecognizable. A smoking, cratered wasteland where the Xyler swarm had once been. Cross surveyed the scene, his heart pounding in his chest. The swarm had been decimated, their advance shattered, but the battle wasn't over yet. "Cade," he said quietly, "get me a status report. I want to know what's left of our forces, and how many Xyler survived that strike." Cade nodded, her fingers flying over the controls. "Yes, sir." As the Marines regrouped and prepared for the next phase of the battle, Cross knew that the fight for Valor 9 was far from over. The Xyler swarm was down, but not out, and the Marines would have to give everything they had to ensure that this planet, and humanity's future, remained in their hands. The dust and smoke from the orbital strike had barely begun to settle when the next wave of Xyler swarm appeared on the horizon. Captain Ethan Cross, still standing on the command bridge, watched as the tactical display began to light up with red markers, indicating the arrival of more enemy forces. The swarm wasn't done, and they were coming back with renewed fury. "We've only bought ourselves a little time," Lieutenant Sarah Cade said, her voice tense. "The orbital strike took out a good portion of their forces, but there's still a massive wave heading our way." Cross grimaced. The Xyler were relentless, a species driven by an insatiable hunger to conquer and consume. They didn't care about losses, they only cared about victory. The Marines had managed to slow them down, but the odds were still against them. "Get me a status report," Cross ordered. "What's left of our forces?" Cade quickly pulled up the data. "We've lost nearly a third of our troops. Our artillery took heavy damage during the fallback, and we're running low on ammunition. The reserves are holding, but we can't take another hit like that." Cross clenched his fists. They were outgunned, outnumbered, and out of options. But he wasn't about to give up. Not yet. "We'll make our final stand here," he said, his voice firm. "We'll hold this line until the last man if we have to. This planet is the key to the entire sector. If we lose it, the Xyler will have a clear path to the core worlds." Cade nodded, her expression grim. "Understood, sir. I'll relay the orders." As Cade moved to coordinate the defenses, Cross took a moment to assess the situation. The secondary perimeter was their last line of defense, a hastily constructed fortification that encircled the command post. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. The Marines were exhausted, battered from hours of relentless fighting, but their spirits remained unbroken. They knew what was at stake, and they were prepared to give everything they had to protect humanity's future. "Captain," a voice crackled over the comms, "we've got something on the long-range sensors. It's big." Cross turned to the sensor officer. "What is it?" The officer's face was pale as he looked at the readings. "It's the Xyler mothership, sir. It's moving into position above us." Cross felt a chill run down his spine. The Xyler mothership was a behemoth, a massive warship that served as the command center for the swarm's operations. It was heavily armed, capable of leveling entire cities with a single barrage. If it was positioning itself above Valor 9, it meant that Xyler were preparing for a final, devastating strike. "Get me targeting data on that ship," Cross said, his voice hard. "If they're going to take us down, we'll make sure they pay for it." As the sensor officer scrambled to get the data, Cross turned his attention back to the battlefield. The Xyler forces were closing in fast, a seemingly endless tide of alien warriors swarming across the plains. The Marines opened fire, their weapons blazing as they tried to stem the oncoming horde. The air was filled with the deafening roar of gunfire and explosions, the ground shaking as the two forces clashed in a desperate struggle for control. "Captain, we've got the data," the sensor officer called out. "But sir, the mothership's shields are too strong. Our weapons won't be able to penetrate them." Cross's jaw tightened. The situation was growing more dire by the second. The mothership's shields were indeed formidable, designed to withstand even the most powerful of attacks. But he wasn't about to let that stop him. "Cade," he said, turning to his second-in-command, "I want you to prepare a strike team. We're going to take the fight to them." Cade looked at him in surprise. "Sir, you mean board the mothership?" "That's right," Cross replied. "If we can't take it down from the ground, we'll do it from the inside. We'll plant charges on their power core and take out their shields. It's our only chance." Cade hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Understood. I'll get the team ready." As Cade moved to assemble the strike team, Cross took one last look at the battlefield. The Marines were holding their ground, but it was clear that they couldn't hold out much longer. The Xyler swarm was closing in, their sheer numbers overwhelming the human defenders. It was now or never. With a deep breath, Cross turned and headed toward the hangar. The strike team was already waiting for him, a group of the best and bravest soldiers the Terran Marines had to offer. They were armed to the teeth, their faces set with determination. They knew the risks, but they also knew what was at stake. "All right, listen up," Cross said as he approached the team. "This is a one-way trip. We get in, we take out the power core, and we get out. If we succeed, we might just save this planet and the entire sector. If we fail, well, we won't be around to worry about that." The soldiers nodded, their expressions grim but resolute. They were ready to give their lives for this mission, and Cross couldn't help but feel a surge of pride in their bravery. "Let's move," he said, and the team quickly boarded the dropship that would take them to the Xyler mothership. As the dropship lifted off and sped toward the looming alien warship, Cross couldn't shake the feeling that this might be the last mission he ever commanded. But if it meant saving humanity, it was a sacrifice he was willing to make. The dropship soared through the atmosphere, dodging debris and stray energy blasts from the battlefield below. As they approached the Xyler mothership, the sheer scale of the alien vessel became evident. It was massive, a dark and ominous presence that blotted out the stars. The ship's surface was covered in strange, organic-looking structures that pulsed with a faint, eerie light. "We're coming in hot," the pilot called out, his voice tense. "Brace yourselves." The dropship swooped down toward the mothership, aiming for a weak point in its defenses. As they neared the ship, the pilot fired thrusters, slowing their descent and bringing them in for a rough landing on one of the ship's many docking platforms. The moment the dropship touched down, the doors flew open and the strike team leaped out, weapons at the ready. The platform was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the ship's systems. The team quickly moved into position, securing the area and scanning for any signs of enemy activity. "Looks like we're clear," Cade said, her voice low. "Let's move." Cross led the way, the team following close behind as they made their way through the alien vessel's twisted corridors. The interior of the ship was a maze of organic-looking structures, the walls covered in strange, pulsating veins that glowed with an otherworldly light. The air was thick with a sickly sweet smell, like decaying flesh, and every now and then they would pass a strange, chittering sound that echoed through the halls. "Stay sharp," Cross whispered, his eyes scanning the shadows. "We're deep in enemy territory now." The team moved with practiced precision, their footsteps silent as they crept through the alien ship. They had a clear objective, the power core. If they could destroy it, they would bring down the mothership's shields, leaving it vulnerable to a full-scale assault from the human fleet. As they advanced deeper into the ship, the corridors began to widen, leading them into a massive chamber that housed the power core. The core itself was a towering, pulsating structure, surrounded by strange, alien machinery that emitted a low, ominous hum. The room was bathed in a dim red light, casting eerie shadows on the walls. "All right, this is it," Cross said, signaling the team to move into position. "Plant the charges, and be ready to move out on my signal." The soldiers quickly spread out, placing explosive charges at key points around the power core. The seconds ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity as they worked as quickly and quietly as they could. But just as the last charge was set, the chittering sound they had heard earlier grew louder. The team froze, their eyes darting around the chamber as the sound grew closer and closer. "They're coming," Cade whispered, her grip tightening on her rifle. Cross knew they were out of time. "Detonate the charges on my mark," he ordered. "Then we run like hell." The chittering grew to a deafening roar as a swarm of Xyler soldiers poured into the chamber, their insectoid bodies moving with terrifying speed. The strike team opened fire, their weapons blazing as they tried to hold back the tide of alien warriors. "Now," Cross shouted. The explosives detonated with a massive explosion, sending a shockwave through the ship and tearing the power core apart. The chamber shook violently, and the lights flickered as the ship's systems went haywire. "Move, move, move," Cross yelled, leading the team in a desperate dash back to the dropship. The corridors were now alive with the sounds of alarms and the screeches of enraged Xyler warriors. The team ran at full speed, firing behind them to keep the pursuing aliens at bay. The ship was starting to fall apart, the walls cracking and the floors shaking as the damage from the explosion spread. "Captain, the dropship is just ahead," Cade called out, her voice barely audible over the din. They burst out onto the docking platform, the dropship's engines already fired up and ready to go. The team didn't hesitate. They leaped aboard, and the pilot slammed the thrusters, lifting them off the platform just as the mothership began to implode. "Punch it," Cross shouted, and the pilot complied, pushing the dropship's engines to their limit as they raced away from the dying mothership. As they cleared the ship, the viewports were filled with the sight of the massive alien warship tearing itself apart, the explosion from the power core spreading through its structure. The mothership's shields flickered, and then collapsed entirely, leaving it defenseless. "Sir, we did it," Cade said, her voice filled with relief. "The mothership is down." Cross allowed himself a small smile. They had done the impossible. They had taken down the Xylar mothership from the inside. But the battle wasn't over yet. "Get us back to the command ship," he ordered. "We've still got a war to win." Back on the command ship, Cross and his strike team were greeted with cheers as they returned. The news of the mothership's destruction had spread quickly, boosting the morale of the beleaguered Marines on the ground. The Xylar forces, now without their central command, were in disarray, their attacks becoming more frantic and less coordinated. "Captain, we got the Xylar on the run," Cade reported, her voice filled with determination. "Their forces are starting to retreat." Cross nodded, a sense of relief washing over him. The tide was finally turning in their favor. The destruction of the mothership had crippled the Xylar's command structure, leaving their ground forces vulnerable and confused. Now was the time to press the advantage. "Order all units to advance," Cross commanded. "We're not letting them get away. We push them off this planet and send them running back to wherever they came from." The order was relayed, and the Marines, reinvigorated by their recent victory, surged forward with renewed energy. The Xylar swarm, once a seemingly unstoppable force, was now in full retreat, their lines breaking under the relentless assault of the human forces. The battlefield was a chaotic scene of destruction as the Marines advanced, cutting down the fleeing Xylar warriors. The automated turrets and artillery, now with fresh targeting data, rained death upon the retreating aliens, turning the tide of the battle completely. "Sir, we've got incoming transmission from High Command," Cade said, her voice breaking through the sounds of battle. Cross turned to the communications officer. "Patch it through." The holographic display flickered to life, revealing the image of Admiral Holt, the commander of the human fleet. The Admiral's face was stern, but there was a glint of pride in his eyes. "Captain Cross, I've just received word of your success," Admiral Holt said. "You and your team have done a remarkable job. The destruction of the Xylar mothership has turned the tide of this battle." "Thank you, sir," Cross replied. "But the fight's not over yet. We're still driving the Xylar off Valar 9. "Understood," Holt said. "Reinforcements are on their way to assist you. We'll mop up the remaining Xylar forces and secure the planet. You've done your part, Captain. Now, let's finish this." The transmission ended, and Cross turned back to the tactical display. The Xylar forces were in full retreat, their lines breaking as the Marines pressed forward. The battle for Valar 9 was nearing its end, but Cross knew that they couldn't afford to let their guard down. The Xylar were a tenacious enemy, and they would fight to the last. "Keep pushing, but stay vigilant," Cross ordered. "We don't want any surprises." The Marines continued their advance, cutting down the fleeing Xylar forces and securing the planet's surface. The automated turrets and artillery provided covering fire, ensuring that the retreating aliens couldn't regroup. The Xylar, once a fearsome and seemingly unstoppable force, were now being hunted down like animals. As the battle raged on, Cross took a moment to reflect on what they had accomplished. They had faced an enemy that outnumbered them, that was relentless in its pursuit of conquest, and they had held the line. The destruction of the Xylar mothership had turned the tide of the battle, and now they were driving the alien invaders off Valar 9. But Cross knew that this victory had come at a great cost. Many brave soldiers had given their lives to protect this planet, and the battle had left the planet scared and devastated. Valar 9 had been a beautiful world once, but now it was a war-torn wasteland, its surface littered with the wreckage of battle and the bodies of the fallen. As the last of the Xylar forces were driven off the planet, the Marines began the process of securing the area and tending to the wounded. The battlefield was a grim sight, with the bodies of both human and alien soldiers strewn across the ground. But despite the devastation, there was a sense of relief in the air. They had won. They had held the line. "Sir, the Xylar forces are retreating from the planet," Cade reported, her voice filled with a mix of exhaustion and triumph. "We've done it." Cross nodded, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. "Yes, we have. But the war isn't over. The Xylar will regroup, and they'll come back. We need to be ready." Cade nodded in agreement. "Understood, sir. We'll be ready." As the Marines began the process of securing Valor 9 and preparing for the next phase of the war, Cross couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. They had faced an overwhelming enemy and emerged victorious, but he knew that the Xylar were far from defeated. The war would continue, and they would need to be prepared for whatever came next. But for now, they had won a crucial victory, and that was enough. The battle for Valor 9 was over, but the planet bore the scars of the fierce conflict. The once barren plains were now littered with the wreckage of war, destroyed vehicles, shattered weapons, and the bodies of fallen soldiers from both sides. The air was thick with the acrid smell of smoke and burning metal, a stark reminder of the price paid for victory. Captain Ethan Cross stood on a ridge overlooking the battlefield, his gaze sweeping across the devastation. The Marines had held the line, but the cost had been high. Many of his men lay among the dead, their sacrifice etched into the very soil of the planet they had fought to protect. "Captain," Lieutenant Sarah Cade's voice broke through his reverie. She approached, her face showing the weariness of the long battle. "We've secured the area. The remaining Xylar forces have retreated, and we're beginning the cleanup operation." Cross nodded, his expression grim. "Good work, Lieutenant. Make sure the wounded are taken care of, and prepare a report for High Command. They'll want to know the full extent of the damage." Cade hesitated for a moment, then spoke softly. "Sir, we've lost a lot of good men out there. The medics are doing what they can, but it's bad." Cross clenched his fists, his heart heavy with the weight of command. He had led these men into battle, and while they had won, the victory felt hollow in the face of the lives lost. But he couldn't afford to dwell on it. There was still work to be done. "I know, Cade," he said quietly. "We'll mourn them later. Right now, we need to focus on securing the planet and preparing for whatever comes next." Cade nodded, understanding the unspoken burden they both carried. She turned and headed back to oversee the recovery efforts, leaving Cross alone on the ridge. As he stood there, Cross couldn't help but think about the future. The Xylar swarm had been dealt a significant blow, but they were far from defeated. They would regroup, rebuild, and come back stronger. And when they did, humanity would need to be ready. But for now, at least, they had bought themselves some time. Time to fortify their defenses, time to prepare for the next battle, and time to honor the fallen. Cross took a deep breath and turned away from the battlefield. There was still much to do, and he couldn't afford to waste any time. He headed back to the command post, where the other officers were waiting for him. "Captain, we've received a transmission from High Command," one of the officers reported as he entered the room. "They're sending reinforcements to help secure the planet and begin the rebuilding process." Cross nodded, relieved that help was on the way. "Good. We'll need all the support we can get. Begin coordinating with the incoming forces and start setting up defensive positions. We can't afford to be caught off guard." The officers quickly got to work, relaying orders and organizing the post-battle efforts. The command center was a flurry of activity, but there was a sense of purpose in the air. They had won the battle, and now they needed to secure the peace. As the hours passed, the cleanup operation continued. The wounded were tended to, the dead were honored, and the wreckage of war was cleared away. It was a grim task, but one that had to be done. The planet of Valor 9 would never be the same, but it was still theirs, and they would rebuild. Captain Cross remained focused on the task at hand, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the battle. The Xylar had underestimated humanity, and they had paid the price. But Cross knew that the war was far from over. The Xylar would return, and when they did, they would be more determined than ever. But so would humanity. The battle for Valor 9 has shown them that they could stand against the swarm, that they could hold the line even when the odds were stacked against them. And that knowledge, that belief, would carry them through the dark days ahead. Captain, Cade's voice brought him back to the present. She stood beside him, holding a data pad with the latest reports. The reinforcements have arrived. They're beginning to set up defensive positions around the key installations. Good, Cross replied. Make sure they have everything they need. I don't want any surprises when the Sylar come back. Cade nodded and turned to leave, but she paused for a moment, looking back at Cross. Sir, we did good today. We saved this planet. Cross met her gaze, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Yes, we did. But this is just the beginning. There's a long road ahead of us, and we need to be ready for whatever comes next. Cade smiled back, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten. We'll be ready, sir. As she left to oversee the reinforcements, Cross took a moment to reflect on her words. They had saved Valor 9, but the war was far from over. The Xylar swarm was still out there, and they would return with a vengeance. But humanity had proven that they were not to be underestimated. They were strong, they were determined, and they would fight for their survival. And when the Xylar came back, they would be ready. With Valor 9 secured, and the Xylar forces driven off the planet, the human forces began the process of rebuilding and fortifying their defenses. Reinforcements had arrived, bringing fresh supplies and personnel to help with the effort. The once barren planet was now a hive of activity as the Marines worked tirelessly to prepare for the next phase of the war. Captain Ethan Cross was overseeing the construction of a new command center when he received a priority transmission from High Command. The message was encrypted and marked as urgent, which immediately put him on edge. Patch it through to my quarters, Cross ordered, stepping away from the construction site. He made his way to the temporary command center, where he activated the secure communications link. The holographic display flickered to life, revealing the stern face of Admiral Holt. Captain Cross, we have a situation, the Admiral said without preamble. Our intelligence has intercepted communications from the Xylar swarm. They're planning a counterattack, and it's bigger than anything we've seen before. Cross felt a cold knot form in his stomach. How big are we talking, sir? The Xylar are mobilizing their entire fleet, Holt replied, his expression grim. They're pulling forces from multiple sectors, and they're converging on Valor 9. They're determined to retake the planet, and they're willing to throw everything they have at us to do it. Cross's mind raced as he processed the information. The battle for Valor 9 had been costly, and while they had managed to hold the line, they were still recovering. A full-scale assault from the entire Xylar fleet would be devastating. Sir, we'll need every available resource to defend this planet, Cross said, his voice steady despite the rising tension. We've started fortifying our positions, but we'll need more ships, more troops, and more firepower if we're going to stand a chance. Agreed, Holt said. I'm already mobilizing additional fleets to reinforce your position. We're also deploying experimental weapons platforms to give you an edge. But make no mistake, Captain, this is going to be the toughest fight of your career. Cross nodded, fully aware of the gravity of the situation. The Xylar were not known for giving up easily, and if they were willing to commit their entire fleet to retaking Valor 9, it meant they saw the planet as a critical strategic asset, and that made it all the more important for humanity to hold it. We'll hold the line, sir, Cross said with determination. We won't let the Xylar take this planet. Good, Holt replied. I have faith in you and your men, Captain. But be prepared for the worst. The Xylar are desperate, and desperate enemies are the most dangerous. The transmission ended, leaving Cross alone in the command center. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for the battle to come. The Xylar were coming, and they were bringing everything they had. But Cross was determined to meet them head-on. He quickly relayed the news to his officers, who immediately began preparing for the impending assault. The atmosphere in the command center was tense, But there was also a sense of resolve. They had faced impossible odds before, and they had prevailed. They could do it again. As the preparations continued, Cross found himself thinking about the men and women under his command. They had fought bravely in the battle for Valor 9, and many of them had paid the ultimate price. The thought of losing even more lives in the coming battle weighed heavily on him, but he knew that they had no choice. They had to hold the planet, no matter the cost. The hours passed in a blur of activity as the Marines fortified their positions and the reinforcements began to arrive. The experimental weapons platforms, massive structures bristling with advanced weaponry, were deployed around key installations, providing a much-needed boost to their defenses. But even with the reinforcements and the new weapons, Cross knew that they were facing an uphill battle. The Xylar were relentless, and they would stop at nothing to retake the planet. The coming days would test them in ways they had never been tested before. As the sun set over the war-torn landscape of Valor 9, Cross stood on the battlements of the newly constructed command center, looking out over the horizon. In the distance, he could see the faint glimmers of the Xylar fleet as it began to enter the system. The battle was about to begin. "Captain," Cade's voice called out from behind him. She joined him on the battlements, her expression serious. "The Xylar fleet is closing in. We've detected multiple capital ships, along with a swarm of smaller vessels. It's going to be a hell of a fight." Cross nodded, his eyes fixed on the approaching fleet. "We'll give them everything we've got. They won't take this planet without a fight." Cade smiled, her confidence unwavering. "We'll hold the line, sir, no matter what." As the first Xylar ships broke through the atmosphere, the ground trembled with the impact of their landing craft. The battle for Valor 9 was about to begin, and this time, the stakes were higher than ever. Cross gripped the railing, his resolve hardening. The Xylar had underestimated humanity once before, and they were about to make the same mistake again. "Prepare for battle," he ordered, his voice steady and commanding. "This is our planet, and we're not giving it up." The Marines snapped to attention, their weapons at the ready. The automated turrets whirred to life, their targeting systems locking onto the incoming Xylar forces. The experimental weapons platforms hummed with energy, their power building as they prepared to unleash devastation on the enemy. The Xylar had brought their entire fleet, but humanity had something more powerful: the will to survive. And that was a force that no enemy, no matter how powerful, could ever truly defeat. As the first shots were fired, Captain Ethan Cross knew that the battle for Valor 9 would be remembered as one of the fiercest and most pivotal conflicts in the history of the human-Xylar war, and he was determined to ensure that it would also be remembered as a victory. The battle for Valor 9 had reached its climax. The Xylar fleet had descended upon the planet with overwhelming force, their ships darkening the skies as they launched wave after wave of assault craft. The ground trembled with the impact of their landing forces, and the air was thick with the sounds of battle. Captain Ethan Cross stood at the command center's control station, his eyes fixed on the tactical display. The situation was dire. The Xylar were throwing everything they had at them, and the human defenders were stretched to their limit. The experimental weapons platforms were holding the line, but barely. The sheer numbers of the Xylar were threatening to overwhelm their defenses. "Captain, the northern perimeter is under heavy attack," Lieutenant Sarah Cade reported, her voice tense. "The Xylar have breached the outer defenses and are advancing on the command center." Cross's jaw tightened. "Deploy all available reserves to the northern perimeter. We can't let them reach the command center." The order was relayed, and the remaining reserves, a mix of Marines and automated combat drones, were dispatched to reinforce the northern defenses. But Cross knew that they were running out of time. The Xylar were relentless, and their numbers seemed endless. As the battle raged on, Cross could feel the weight of every decision he made. The lives of his men and the fate of the planet rested on his shoulders. He had fought in countless battles before, but this one felt different. The Xylar were more determined, more aggressive than he had ever seen them. "Captain, we're picking up a massive energy signature from the Xylar flagship," Cade said, her voice filled with alarm. "It's powering up some kind of weapon. If they fire, it could wipe out the entire command center." Cross's heart raced. The Xylar were preparing to unleash a weapon of mass destruction, and he had only moments to act. "Focus all fire on that flagship," he ordered. "We need to take it out before it can fire." The command center's targeting systems locked onto the Xylar flagship, and the experimental weapons platforms unleashed a barrage of energy beams and missiles. The sky lit up with explosions as the human forces concentrated their fire on the massive alien ship. But the Xylar flagship was heavily armored, and despite the intense barrage, it continued to power up its weapon. Cross watched in horror as the energy signature on the tactical display grew stronger. "Sir, it's about to fire," Cade shouted. Time seemed to slow as Cross made a split-second decision. "All units, brace for impact." The Xylar flagship unleashed its weapon, a massive energy beam that lanced through the sky, aimed directly at the command center. The ground shook with the force of the impact, and the air was filled with a blinding light. But just as the beam was about to strike, one of the experimental weapons platforms, damaged but still operational, fired its last shot. The beam struck the Xylar flagship, piercing its hull and causing a catastrophic explosion. The alien ship was engulfed in flames as it began to break apart, its weapon disintegrating before it could unleash its full power. The Xylar flagship's destruction sent shockwaves through the enemy fleet. The remaining Xylar ships hesitated, their advance faltering as the loss of their command ship left them disorganized and vulnerable. Cross seized the opportunity. "All units, counterattack. Push them back." The human forces, emboldened by the destruction of the Xylar flagship, launched a fierce counteroffensive. The Marines on the ground advanced with renewed vigor, cutting through the Xylar forces with brutal efficiency. The experimental weapons platforms, though battered and barely operational, continued to fire, adding their power to the assault. The Xylar, caught off guard by the sudden counterattack, began to retreat. Their forces were in disarray, their command structure shattered by the loss of their flagship. What had been a relentless assault was now a desperate attempt to escape. "Sir, the Xylar are pulling back," Cade reported, her voice filled with disbelief. "We're driving them off." Cross allowed himself a moment of relief, but he knew the battle wasn't over yet. "Don't let up. Keep the pressure on them. We need to make sure they don't regroup." The human forces pursued the retreating Xylar, pushing them back toward their landing zones. The once overwhelming enemy force was now in full retreat, their morale shattered and their numbers dwindling. As the last of the Xylar ships lifted off from the surface of Valor 9, the skies cleared, revealing the devastation of the battle. The planet's surface was scared by the intense fighting, and the bodies of the fallen lay scattered across the battlefield. But they had done it. They had held the line. The Xylar had been driven off, and Valor 9 was still in human hands. Captain Ethan Cross stood on the battlements of the command center, looking out over the battlefield. The cost had been high, but they had won. The Xylar had underestimated humanity once again, and they had paid the price. Cade joined him, her expression weary but triumphant. "We did it, sir. We beat them." Cross nodded, but his thoughts were already on the future. The Xylar would be back, and the war was far from over. But they had shown the galaxy that humanity was not to be underestimated. They had faced the Xylar's full might and had emerged victorious. "We did," Cross said, his voice filled with quiet determination. "But this is just the beginning. The war isn't over yet. We need to be ready for whatever comes next." Cade smiled, her confidence unwavering. "We will be, sir. We've proven that we can stand against the swarm, and we'll keep fighting until the war is won." As the sun began to rise over the war-torn landscape of Valor 9, Cross felt a renewed sense of purpose. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. There were still challenges ahead, still battles to be fought. But he knew that humanity was strong, resilient, and determined. They had faced the might of the Xylar swarm and had emerged victorious. And as long as they continued to fight with the same courage and resolve, they would prevail. The Xylar had underestimated humanity, and they had learned a harsh lesson. Now, it was time to take the fight to them. The battle for Galar 9 would be remembered as a turning point in the war, a moment when humanity stood firm against overwhelming odds and proved that they were a force to be reckoned with. And Captain Ethan Cross would lead them to victory.